お時間になりましたので、シンポジウムを再開させていただきます。
Therefore, we would like to resume the symposium.
2番目の基調講演は、
Now, we would like to invite over second keynote speaker for today. We have Dr. GALIZIA Giovanni, Director of the Zukunftskolleg, University of Konstanz. His specialty is zoology and neuroscience, and he is especially focusing on his research on the brain and biology of the honeybees. And he has served as the research group leader of the Free University Berlin and had taught at UC Riverside. And he is also currently serving as a director for the Zukunftskolleg, and also is also the permanent fellow at the college in Berlin. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I got the technology on, the microphone is on. Thank you all very much. Thank you to WIAS, and thank you also to all the online participants for being here. Well-being in an animal society. I would like to start because I'm a guest from Konstanz, and it is an enormous honor to be here as part of the Zukunftskolleg, and I would like to give you 1 or 2 slides, 3, for explaining what is the Zukunftskolleg. An institute of advanced studies with a focus on young researchers, and the Zukunftskolleg was founded 15 years ago, and so it's really emotionally loaded for me to see and to have this birthday, which is the same as WIAS, 15 years. We have a focus on 2-year and 5-year fellowships for researchers that come from all the disciplines that we have at the University of Konstanz: humanities, social and natural sciences. And it's a strong component of how the university wants to develop also a sort of communication across the different disciplines. The sort of key buzzwords that we use here is to create early independence, because many of the very good ideas in research come at an early age. And that means that we have to create spaces where people can develop their own research. In an international perspective, we are happy to have researchers coming from all over the world to Konstanz, to the Zukunftskolleg. Across generations, we have senior fellows and young researchers within the university. So the Zukunftskolleg is not on the side of the university, but is embedded in the departments and with an interdisciplinary angle. So a lot of discussions across the disciplines, even though the research projects themselves are fairly rooted within their own discipline. So key elements: research fellowships, 5-year positions that come to build a research group, postdoctoral fellowship, that is 2-year postdoc positions to establish your own the research topic, senior fellowships, established career scientists coming from outside to sort of strengthen the environment that is present in Konstanz, and the Zuconnect or Hertz Fellows. This is an instrument for short-term fellowships that we invented and that we introduced because we saw that we were biased in covering the world. And we were lacking researchers coming from the global south. And so we created an instrument where we could be more attractive to researchers coming from Africa, from Latin America, and from the poorer countries in Asia. So looking back, we cover, and this you see this on the right-hand part of the slide, we cover all the disciplines that we have at the university. Over the 15 years, we have awarded 138 of these fellowships, somewhat balanced across the genders with 64% international fellows. So let me move to honeybees, because my own discipline, I'm a biologist, I'm a neuroscientist, I study the brains of honeybees. And when I read the title of this symposium, Well-being in an Animal Society, I couldn't sort of resist from thinking that honeybees, they form societies, and they form quite successful societies. And in fact, this is not something that I discovered. If you look into the European, into Greek philosophy, Aristotle, 2,400 years ago, already said honeybees are a political animal, a zone political. They form societies and they form politics. And you go to the Romans, Virgil as an example, he loved honeybees as the perfect society. Perfect because of many things. You must imagine Virgil lived in Rome when the sort of empire was a very corrupt empire, and the emperors only became emperors to become rich, but it didn't help them a lot because they remained emperors only for a year or two, and then they were generally assassinated. So all that richness then went to the family. Julius Caesar was assassinated, his successor were assassinated. And Virgil was feeling we need a better example for our society. And he thought of the bees, because the bees were pure, they had no sex. And there was a leader, a guardian for the laborers, and this leader really kept this crowd of large numbers together, and that was the example to follow. Shakespeare would go and say here, for so work the honeybees, creatures that by a rule in nature teach the art of order to a peopled kingdom. They have a king and officers of sort, where some, like magistrates, correct at home, others, like merchants, venture trade abroad, others, like soldiers, armed in their stings, make boot upon the summer's velvet buds, and so on. And he explains how perfect these bees are, the king and the workers and the merchants. And then comes comes research. Jan Swammerdam dissected the bees and could prove that the bees, in fact, are not males. It's not a king. It's not workers that are soldiers and male soldiers. It's all females. Well, he proved that, but it was already discovered earlier by Charles Butler, who showed that the queen was laying eggs and that the workers could also sometimes lay eggs. So he said, well, okay, this is a female society. And he proposed, seeing that bees are female, that in fact maybe the perfect society is not a king, but it's the matriarchate. And he wrote about we should take bees as an example for matriarchates. Now, if you look at today's books, one of my colleagues, Tom Seeley, exceptionally good biologist who works on bees, when he describes bees, he says, well, honeybee democracy, this is his book. So he now says, well, it's not a king, it's not a queen of sorts, it's a democracy. And why? Because it's all the workers, it's all the animals in that hive that contribute to deciding what the hive is doing. So in a way, if you look at history, the description of the bee hive is more a reflection of the human society and what humans think about their society, sort of projected onto the bee, rather than the bee society being investigated and telling us what do they do. So I would like to take a few minutes and talk about bees. How do they live? What is the role of the queen and the brood and the workers? And put that into a perspective. So how do they live? Bees, if you look into the hive, hives are enormous. 50,000 animals in summer. All of them almost workers. There's one queen, a little bit larger. The queen lays eggs every day, in summer up to 1,000 eggs every single day. And then there are the drones, these are the male bees, and the drones are lazy, as everybody knows. What they do is they feed and then they fly out, follow a queen, a virgin queen, and want to mate with that queen. The queen flies out only once in her life and gets mated by 5 or 10 or 15 drones. These are the successful drones. When they mate, they die. The other drones that do not manage to mate with the queen have to fly back into the hive and try the next time. And maybe they will be successful. Most of them will not and will die without having mated any time, and their genes are lost. Now, the one queen, the many, many workers, and the drones that... Now, why are bees social animals? How come that within insects we have social insects, and these are the bees, the ants, the wasps? They all belong to one family, the Hymenoptera. And what makes this family special is that they are haplodiploid. Now that means, that is the expression of how they determine their sex. In these Hymenoptera, the bees, the ants, and the wasps, if an egg is fertilized, that egg develops into a female. So it has 2 sets of chromosomes. If it's not fertilized, it develops into a male. It has only 1 set of chromosomes. Now, the queen is mated and she will lay eggs, and she can decide when she's laying an egg whether to add a sperm or not. If she adds a sperm, then that egg is fertilized and it will develop into a worker bee, a female, or into a new queen. If she doesn't add a sperm, that egg is not fertilized and it will develop into a male. So it's the queen that decides whether it's males or females. Now that has a consequence in genetics and in relationship. And the consequence is that in fact female worker bees are more related to their sisters if they come from the same father than to their mother or their daughters. And that means if you think about this as sort of an evolutionary game where you want to transmit your genes, that for a bee, for a worker bee, it's more efficient. You transmit more genes to the next generation if you help a sister rather than helping a daughter or creating a daughter or having laying an egg. And that was suggested as a sort of evolutionary driving force for why it's in the Hymenoptera that we find most of the social insect species. That doesn't work anymore that much because there are many examples where this doesn't really make sense. The problem of having multiple males mating with the mother, and the observation that also termites are social insects and they are not haplodiploid. But overall, it's still the best explanation that we have. But it creates one effect. If you have a social insect, that means that the work in the hive is divided. And the question is, how is that work divided? It's divided in the bees by age. The young bees stay in the hive, the young bees clean the hive, they care for the brood. The older bees go out and collect pollen, collect nectar. You see this here, this is over time. The first 21 days, they are just pupa and they sit there and are fed. The next 21 days, in a simplified sort of life of the bee, they do inside work in the hive, and then they fly outside. Now that is a very stable system. Not all social insects work that way. Like ants, many ants will have different sizes, and that means that the different castes of the ants are born workers, or they are born nurses, or they are born soldiers. Not in the bees. In the bees, the single animal is first a nurse, then a worker, and flying outside and becomes a soldier. Now, that might be stable, or it might not. And the question is, who decides when would the bee switch from being an inside worker, a nurse, or an outside worker collecting nectar? In a normal situation, if there is no crisis, that could be just age, like in this slide, 21 days. But if there is a crisis, maybe too many of the collecting bees would die, maybe you have to adjust. And in fact, in an experiment, you can do that. You can remove all of the nurses and you only have foragers. Now the hive doesn't work anymore. And what happens is that the foragers come back with the pollen, they come back with the nectar, and they find no nurses that can take that nectar and can take that pollen and bring it to the brood. Now, if they do that, at a certain point, a few of these foragers will convert back to being nurses. And you can do the opposite. You can take the nurses and remove all the foragers, so you keep the nurses. Now suddenly the nurses are inside the hive and no pollen arrives, no nectar arrives. And now a few nurses will become early, premature foragers. So it's self-organizing. And the question when you have a self-organizing system is, you want to avoid that all of them change at the same time, because then you would have the other problem. Right? And in fact, that was studied, and the reason and the mechanism by which they can sort of convert into the other stage over time is by having a particular gene, the forager gene, and that is quite different from an individual to the next. And it's always those that have a certain expression of the forager gene which will be the first one to convert. So it is the diversity in that gene, within the population of the bees, within the hive, that creates a sort of regular and organized transition from one stage to the next. So that is what happens when we remove all the foragers or all the nurses. The remaining bees split, they redistribute their tasks, and they do that in an orderly fashion thanks to a diversity in the genotype across the hive. And this is one of the reasons why the queen is not mating with a single male, but with many males. Because by mating with many males, you get a diversity of the phenotypes within the hive. So how does the queen rule, if we say the queen rules? One of the ways she does is by a pheromone, the queen mandibular pheromone. And this pheromone inhibits the ovaries in the worker bees, because the worker bees are female. So in theory, the worker bees could lay eggs, but it's not that, because the pheromone, the queen mandibular pheromone, has an effect like a hormone on the worker bees. Right? It's a primer pheromone. It changes developmental events. There are also releaser pheromones that change the behavior of other animals. Pheromones are chemical substances that are used to communicate within a species. Now, this primer pheromone, this queen mandibular pheromone, is really like a hormone, and the worker bee has no ovaries, no developed ovaries. In fact, if you kill the queen and the queen disappears from the hive has a problem. Now, in that moment, the workers will try to raise a new queen. If they succeed, good. If they do not succeed, the queen pheromone is not there anymore, and all the workers' bees will develop their own ovaries, and they will start laying eggs. The problem is, they will lay eggs, but they are not fertilized because they never flew out to mate with a drone. And therefore, all these eggs that they lay are single chromosome set, and that means they are all males. So the hive will now become a hive that will producing masses of males that can fly out and mate with other queens, but they cannot survive as a hive. Now let me give you a very quick detour to understand how these odors, these pheromones, work in the bees. Because there are thousands of odors out there. These odors are odors of plants, of other animals, of within the hive, and some of them are pheromones. So if we look at the brain of the bee and at these olfactory receptors, the receptors are on the antennae. That is where they smell the odors from the outside world. And that information goes into the brain. This is the red area here. And I have to speed up, otherwise I get into trouble with the timing of our symposium. But I'll show you this picture in particular. This is a representation of two different odors within the brain. What you see here is the response to octanol. These are the two red areas that are activated in the brain, and the two green areas a little bit less activated, and another odor. And what you realize is that whenever you give an odor, there are multiple areas in the brain that are activated. Now that is a system which we call the combinatorial odor coding system, which allows the bee to smell millions of different odors, even though it only has 160 receptors. And that's very similar to what we do in our eyes. We have 3 different kinds of receptors in our eyes, but we can see thousands of colors. And so the bee has 160 receptors for odors, but can smell millions of odors. But that is not always the case. In the case of pheromones, the bees have very specialized receptors that just detect that one pheromone, because this pheromone is such an important chemical for the communication within the hive. So there is the queen substance pheromone receptor that allows the worker bees to immediately spot there is a queen or there is not. So how does the queen keep their people down? She uses a pheromone and inhibits the ovaries. But that would suggest that the queen really is in charge. Well, in fact, she is not. In other cases, for example, it is the workers who control, or the nurses. So if you look at the nurses, I mean, bees sleep. Like we sleep, bees sleep. And the worker bees, the forager bees, they will fly out during the day and they sleep at night. 8 hours sleep and the rest is work. The nurses, they sleep for a few minutes and then they nurse again and they feed the brood. How do they know that they cannot sleep for 8 hours, they only have to sleep for a few minutes? That's again pheromones. And these are pheromones that are not produced by the queen, but these are pheromones that are produced by the brood. So it's a brood that controls the behavior of the nurse bees. And in a very short overview, what I try to say here is you have the queen talking to the hive with her odors, but you also have the brood talking to the hive with their odors. And there are plenty of other examples where the foragers or the nurses use their pheromones. And what happens as a complex system is that all of these messages get exchanged. And it's very difficult to say, oh, it is the queen who rules, or it's the nurse bees, or it's the brood that rules. Because all of them together contribute to the organization. So do we want to compare this with a human society, like the ancient philosopher did? I think it could be interesting, but it's certainly not informative. It's just fun to do it. And one reason that we have to consider is, well, bees are nice. They produce honey. We love them all. They are furry animals. But in fact, social insects, there's so many of them. Wasps, termites, ants. And they have different systems. Take, for example, the clonal radar ant. This is a species of ants where all individuals are queens. They can be small groups, they can be large groups, but every one of these individuals can lay eggs, fertilize, and every one of them can reproduce, and they all live together. It's a social society with a totally different organization of how that society is organized. All females, all lay eggs, different sizes of the colony. Or take the red fire ant. In this ant, we have multiple queens in one colony. Not a single queen in one colony, but an enormous colony and many, many queens. And all these queens lay eggs, but most of the animals in the colony are not fertile, do not lay eggs, are worker ants, or soldier ants, or nurse ants. But a few of them are queens, and they lay eggs. Or take the brown black carpenter ant. This is another interesting case. Here also we have multiple queens. And one nest that has many, many workers, a few queens, but these queens are incompatible in the sense that if one queen is here and the other queen is there in the nest, all is fine, they lay eggs, the workers will interchange. But if one queen meets the other queen, then they fight and they kill each other. So multiple queens, but heavy fighting if they meet each other. Or termites, not hymenopterans, another group within the insects, also social animals. And here we have queen, a single queen, but also a king. A queen and a king. Again, a totally different organization of their social system. What does this tell us when we think about well-being in an animal society, about social insects, giving us examples? So why do we want to look at social insects in the first place? Well, the reason is all of these societies that I told you about, all these different ant species, the termites, the bees, they have that system, and that system has been stable for millions of years. So from a systems point of view, we could say that is a stable system. Millions of years of stability. It does change in evolutionary times, but really long times. Then we look at human societies and we say, okay, human societies are stable maybe for 100 years, 200 years, sometimes only a few years, sometimes a little bit longer, but generally in terms of time, they are much less stable. So we could look at the insect societies to learn from them how to create a stable society. But the problem is, with the diversity of societies that we find in insects, if you give me a human society, I can give you an insect species that would be of that kind. You give me a monarchy, I give you an insect species that would have a sort of monarchical organization. You give me a democracy, I can find you an insect society that is sort of like a democracy. And that means a comparison is fun, but it cannot help us decide about which one is the best one, because they are all stable within insects. So I would have added a few comments about the diversity across institutes of advanced studies, the diversity that I think helps a lot because the more diverse types of institutes of advanced studies we have, the better in the way that we can do research as long as we do communicate. And I like that communication part, and therefore I'm very, very happy to be here and very thankful and grateful for having been given this opportunity. And I thank you very much for your attention.